Could you please introduce yourself and tell us what you do?
I'm David Green. I am visiting professor of history at Cornell. I am both Walt's first undergraduate honors student and his first PhD. I completed my undergraduate work with him in the spring of 1962 and my PhD 5 years later in 1967. I've taught at various universities over my career, but I keep on teaching at Cornell because I feel at this stage of my life, the most important thing that I can do is to pass on to a new generation of Cornell students what I learned from Walt himself. And that's why I keep doing it.
I know you have mentioned before that you consider it an honor and a responsibility that
Indeed.
you were Professor LaFeber's first honor student and PhD student. Why is that?
Well, the fact that I came first is not something for which I claim any particular credit. It's simply a chronological accident. But when you have that legacy, the legacy of having studied with the most insightful, most thoughtful, most brilliant scholar, teacher, and mentor that you could possibly wish for, you don't just take, you do what you can do to give back. And that's why, though I haven't done it continuously over the last half century, I first taught summer session at Cornell at Walt's initiative and invitation in 1969, and I've been doing it on and off ever since, though as of 2019, I have now essentially signed on to do it every summer for as long as my health is good and my mind is clear.
Let me ask you to break down some of what you just mentioned. You spoke about Professor LaFeber, whom I have not had the good opportunity to have met, in such terms, such positive terms. Could you tell us what made him that person that you remember? Maybe tell us some stories too.
Okay. When we lost Walt 2.5 years ago, I posted a tribute on Facebook, and the essence of what I wrote was, there's a great deal of knowledge in this world, but not a whole lot of wisdom. And what set Walt apart, what built his towering reputation, not only on the Cornell campus, but across this country and internationally as well, was his extraordinary wisdom. He well understood the difference. Knowledge is about the acquisition of information. Wisdom is about what you decide to do with the information you have chosen to acquire. And that is where Walt set a standard for all of us who are participating in this weekend, and indeed for the thousands of students that he taught, that he trained, that he mentored in all of his years at Cornell. That's why he remains a towering figure in my life. I miss him every day.
How did that wisdom come across?
I think first and foremost, there was a sense of humanity about Walt. There was a sense of caring about other people. Our history department colleague, Glenn Altschuler, once described Walt using a Yiddish word. He described him as Midwestern Mensch. Now, of course, like so many Yiddish words, and Yiddish is part of my family background as well. It tends to lose something in translation. But the essence of it, and despite its obviously gender-linked origin, we now use it in a more universal, non-binary way. A mensch is a person who not only puts other people first, but who intuitively does the right thing, does the ethical thing, not from any desire for personal gain or advantage, but simply because it is the right thing to do. And it became apparent to me as soon as I entered Walt's academic aura, so to speak, that he was a mensch, a total mensch. I was a month shy of my 18th birthday when, at the beginning of January of 1960, I first walked into what was then denominated as History 742, the second semester of Walt's Foreign Policy Survey. I already knew that I wanted to major in history because I had been fascinated during my first year on campus with Edward Whiting Fox's Western Civilization course. But until that January morning, I really had no clear idea of how I wanted to specialize. By the end of that first hour, I knew what I wanted to do with my life. That was the impact that Walt had. It was immediately apparent. It was incredibly intense. And I've never regretted one moment that I spent in his presence. That's who he was. And I do apologize if occasionally I get a bit emotional. That's who he still is for me.
I think you said 1960, is that
1960.
right? So he was born in 1933.
That's right.
Which meant that he was a mere 27 years old.
Actually, his birthday was August 30th. And so at the time I started with him, I was 17, he was still 26. Some would say, indeed, as you are implying, that's a bit young to be a mentor. But he was more than equal to it. And for 61 years, he played a towering role in my life.
I wonder if you could relate for us, we were not there, what form it took. What was it about his teaching? What was it about what he did? You know, if you could tell us a little bit about specific episodes, perhaps.
That first course was the second half of the Foreign Policy Survey, as I've indicated. And he opened my eyes to the realities, not just of American foreign relations, but of how foreign policy was linked to domestic politics. He never drew a sharp line between domestic policy and foreign policy, because in his view, there was no sharp line, that one was an outgrowth of the other. The reason I was a bit late coming here this morning was that at the panel downstairs, people were asking for audience participation. So I got up and I reviewed or shared with everyone one of Walt's best one-liners. This was in the mid-60s, just as the Vietnam War was heating up. And it was becoming fashionable among Washington elites, the people to whom David Halberstam sarcastically referred in his book as the best and the brightest. It was becoming fashionable for all these heavy-duty intellectuals of the mid-60s to refer to Walt's generation, the generation of the 50s, as the generation that never arrived. We were sitting in Walt's office in West Sibley Hall when he mentioned that, and he grinned, as he often did, and said to me, "The reason we never arrived is that we were always there." And what he meant by that was, his generation had a very basic sense of restraint with respect to the use of American power, particularly military power. And his take on the Vietnam War was that that sense of restraint was being lost. It was being discarded. Indeed, it was being looked upon with contempt by a new generation of policy intellectuals who did not feel that restraint was necessary. But it was more than just teaching us about restraint. It was that Walt made it clear from the very outset that you couldn't understand the evolution of American foreign policy. You couldn't understand how America came to be in the situation that it was without understanding both the history of domestic politics and the intertwined history of foreign policy. And that was what he taught us. And that was how he taught us.
My colleagues and I, very often talk about graduate school as an incredibly stressful time. We didn't have the good fortune of having LaFeber as our mentor, but I wonder what it was like for you at that time as a graduate student to be interacting with Professor LaFeber.
I should back up a little bit, because being in the situation I am, where I did both my undergraduate honors work and my doctorate with him, when I finished my undergraduate training in 1962, at Walt's suggestion and with his support, I was awarded a Woodrow Wilson Foundation Fellowship to begin my graduate work at Stanford with Thomas A. Bailey, following indeed in Walt's footsteps, because when Walt finished his undergraduate work at Hanover, his mentor, Robert Bowers, had sent him out to Stanford to study with Tom Bailey. So off I went. I didn't initially plan that it should happen this way, but as it turned out, I followed in his footsteps a second time by leaving Stanford and Tom Bailey after a year. Walt, as all of my colleagues know, went on to Wisconsin, where he did his PhD with Fred Irving Harrington and William Appleton Williams. By contrast, at Walt's invitation, I came back to Cornell, and I did my own doctoral work with him. So in a sense, being his graduate student was simply a logical extension of what I had done with him as an undergraduate. It's not that that year I spent at Stanford was time wasted. It was simply that the trajectory of my academic career was such that I had this incredible good fortune to be invited back. I didn't have to apply to the PhD program at Cornell. Walt invited me. I'd taken a year off from graduate school and went back to New York City, where I wound up teaching at Bronx Community College, and then decided, well, if I'm going to be a professor, I might as well finish my PhD. Walt was on sabbatical that year. He was down in Washington doing research. So I got on a Greyhound bus and I went down to Washington, and we spent the afternoon together, and we reviewed the various possibilities. I had been offered participation in the program at Wisconsin, at Harvard. But the more we talked about it, the more it became apparent that neither of those was going to be the right fit for me. And finally, Walt just said to me, why don't you come back to Cornell? You've already done graduate courses. You'll get out quickly and you'll start teaching. Well, that was an offer I couldn't refuse. And what happened was, and I should add at this point, Walt was all of 30 years old, but he had already won the Albert J. Beveridge Award for his first book, The New Empire. I still have my original copy. It's on my shelf above my desk. I see it every day. He picked up the phone and he called the department and he talked to the department chair. I don't remember if it was still Knight Biggerstaff or if someone else had succeeded Knight by early 1964. But either way, 5 minutes later, I had a teaching assistantship at Cornell. No paperwork, no hoops to jump through. And the fact that he invited me to come back and study with him was one of the great thrills of my life. And as it turned out, by the time I did start my classes in the fall, that teaching assistantship had metamorphosed into a Cornell graduate fellowship. So I never did become Walt's TA, because when you had a graduate fellowship, you didn't have to be a TA. You didn't have to do any of what TAs do. You could just devote yourself 24/7 to graduate work. And so for me, graduate school in the 60s was a time of incredible excitement and incredible fulfillment, despite all of the tragedy that was unfolding in this country, especially as the war in Vietnam started heating up. And of course, Walt's response to all of that was totally consistent with his entire approach to the study of history. In the fall of 1965, the teach-ins began at Cornell, and several quite prominent Cornell faculty joined in the teach-ins, and there were teach-ins held in Willard Straight Hall in the Memorial Room, which was a fairly large room that held several hundred people. There were teach-ins that were held in Bailey Hall, which held over 2,000 people. Walt didn't initially join in the teach-ins. And because I was one of his graduate students, there were undergraduates who could come to me and did come to me and say, why isn't Professor LaFeber participating in the teach-ins? And I would say to them, at this point, he regards the teach-ins not as academic events, but as political events. And being who he is, he's not willing to cross that line. What eventually happened was, after several months of restraint, by early 1966, Walt decided that the teach-ins had become sufficiently accepted within the Cornell community that they were no longer simply political events. They were indeed part of the Cornell academic experience. And when the word went out that Walt LaFeber was going to do a teach-in at Memorial Auditorium in Willard Straight, the place was packed to overflowing an hour in advance. And Walt did speak at the teach-in. And the very first thing that happened when he opened it up for questions was that a student asked him a question about various aspects of the American involvement in Southeast Asia. This is the kind of thing you never forget. Almost 60 years later, Walt began his response by saying, as I said in the paper, in other words, for Walt, he treated the teach-ins with the same sense of academic integrity, the same absolute insistence upon academic rigor that he displayed in his own classrooms. And to me, that was the moment at which teach-ins became not only part of the Cornell academic mainstream, but because of his prestige, because of the respect in which he was held across the country, the teach-ins passed to a new stage of the American academic experience. And I date the national experiment with student political activism from Walt's decision that there was no longer a line to be crossed, that it was not only possible but necessary for academics, for people with that sense of academic integrity, to make their voices heard, not just locally, but nationally as well. That's the impact he had, not only on me, but on our entire generation and all the generations to come, for as long as he lived. That's who he was.
Did he talk to you during that time about his thoughts, what he was struggling with perhaps, or what his responses were to what was going on around him and you?
Yes, in a word. For Walt, the academic was not separate from the world of reality. It's really interesting listening to the panel discussion this morning to hear the distinction being made between teachers and practitioners. And in fact, it was Professor Engel who pointed out this morning that Walt, too, was a practitioner. But what he practiced was the transmission of understanding to generations of students. And indeed, of course, eventually, Walt's prestige was such that he would be invited down to Washington. And he became a consultant to several administrations. On Friday night, former Congressman Tom Downey of New York, who was also Walt's student, told everyone that when Walt's book, Inevitable Revolutions, which is Walt's analysis of the results of U.S. foreign policy in Central America, came out, Tom bought 40 copies and distributed them to his colleagues in the House of Representatives because he wanted to share Walt's wisdom as widely as he could within policymaking circles. And that was his way of doing it. Once again, a tribute to the impact that Walt had, not just within the so-called ivory tower, but in the real world. That's who he was.
Tell me about your continuing relationship with him after you got your doctorate.
Oh my goodness. Okay, I will tell you this story because many of my colleagues know, some don't. I was teaching at Ohio State after I finished my PhD. I went straight from Cornell to Ohio State. I started in the fall of 1967. I was all of 25 years old. And of course, the war in Vietnam was getting worse and worse and worse. And all of a sudden, I was having dinner at home, watching television on the evening of April 4th, 1968. And suddenly, we got the news that Dr. King had been murdered in Memphis. And of course, I was just glued to the television, trying to fathom all of this, when suddenly my doorbell rang. And there was a group of about half a dozen of my own students in the American Foreign Policy course that I was teaching at Ohio State. And they were looking like the end of the world had just come. And for several of them, you could see that was how shaken up they were. So I invited them all in. And we all sat, and for several hours, we watched the news together. And finally, they went home. I didn't get a lot of sleep that night because I was supposed to lecture the next morning on Jay's Treaty of 1795, which sounds pretty obscure, and indeed it is, although it's not an unimportant treaty, because it was the treaty by which the United States took control of Florida from Spain. But I knew that in the midst of this turmoil, it just wouldn't make sense for me to ignore it in my classroom the next day. So I stayed up until about 3:30 in the morning, writing an alternative lecture. And I walked into my class the next morning, and of course, the entire campus, the entire country was in an uproar. There were federal troops in Washington, in Chicago, I believe in Los Angeles as well, in addition to the 500,000 troops that were already in Vietnam. I was all of 26 at this point. So I said to the students, I can't talk about Jay's Treaty of 1795. There's too much going on. So I'm going to suspend the curriculum, and I'm going to talk about what's happening now in this country today. And I said, I don't want any of you to feel like a captive audience. And if you don't feel comfortable leaving while I'm standing here in the front of the room, I'm going to go out and take a drink of water, which I did. They told me afterwards, nobody moved. Apparently, they wanted to hear what this 26-year-old squirt of an assistant professor had to say. So I gave a history lecture. I talked about the history of violence in America and how violence had become what I referred to as the standard American approach to problem solving, both at home and abroad. And I said, violence abroad and violence at home have the same root. And I said, if there's going to be any future for nonviolence after the leader of the nonviolent movement in this country has himself met a violent death, don't look to the government to perpetuate or promote or even encourage nonviolence. It's not going to happen from the top down. It can only happen from the bottom up. I had students coming up to me during the year and saying to me, you can't flunk me, they'll send me to Vietnam. And of course, my initial reaction, thinking as an academic, was, what about all the guys who were already there because they couldn't afford to go to college? Well, that was an easy, facile answer, but not particularly satisfying either to them or to me. And of course, being a professor, I was in a very protected position. I'd had a student deferment all of my years as both undergraduate and graduate student. And once I became a professor, I had an occupational deferment as well. And I thought about it a lot as I was preparing this lecture. And I realized I couldn't go on that way. And I asked myself a very simple question. Of what use is all of my historical training at this moment if I can't offer my students anything more than words? So when I got to that point in the lecture, telling them that violence at home and violence abroad had the same root, and that with no future for nonviolence if you look to the government to do it, that it had to come from the bottom up. I took out a little card, 2 inches by 3 inches. They all knew what it was. It was, of course, my draft card. And I said to them, this is an IOU for violence, which the government can call in anytime it wants, so long as I carry it. I can't be part of that system anymore. And I said to them as I looked around the room, please understand, I am not suggesting any course of action for any of you. That's not my place. That would be incredibly presumptuous of me and also dangerous. But I do owe it to all of you to let you know where I stand. I believe I was the first professor in the United States to burn his draft card in his classroom. Needless to say, that did not sit well with the Board of Trustees of The Ohio State University. As it happens, this weekend, one of those in attendance was a former student of mine who was in that classroom on April 5th, 1968, when that happened. We hadn't seen each other in several decades. He had to leave last night, but we spent most of the last day and a half just spending time together, sitting together as we were listening to all the discussions. He actually came up to me at the end of that class and he said, gee, Prof. Green, do you think they'll let you finish the semester? And I said, I don't know. They did. But of course, as soon as the semester was over, I was fired by the Board of Trustees by unanimous vote. And not surprisingly, shortly thereafter, I was indicted by the federal government. At that point, I decided I'd really better go up to Ithaca to tell Walt myself, because I didn't want him to hear about it from other sources. So I drove from Columbus, Ohio, to Ithaca, New York, and I told him what happened. When he finally stopped laughing, the first thing he said was, boy, David, you really picked the place to do it. Because Walt, being a Midwesterner, being from Indiana, understood Midwestern politics in a way that I didn't, because I grew up on the East Coast. And of course, he was very much concerned with the politics of it. And it was apparent to him that not only had I already been fired, but there was going to be a trial. I was going to be convicted. But the reason I'm telling you this story, and that it's going to be on the record now in the Oral History Project, is that at that point, Walt had just been appointed department chair at Cornell. He was not yet 35. But he was held in such esteem by his senior colleagues that they entrusted him with the chairmanship of the department. And he said immediately, if you're not in jail by next summer, you'll come back and teach summer session at Cornell. Walt had a very clear sense of what he could and couldn't do as the new department chair. And he understood that it would be within his purview to make that offer to me, and he knew his department colleagues would support him. And indeed they did. And I did have a federal trial. And I was convicted. And at that point, no other American university would touch me. There was a Canadian university that offered me a position. It was the University of Saskatchewan in Midwestern Canada, because they were pretty much removed from American politics and it didn't matter to them. And as it turned out, my trial finally came up in April of 1969. And of course I was convicted, but my attorney, who was a former Ohio State law professor who'd gone into private practice, gave a brilliant plea before sentencing. He said to the judge in appropriately lawyerly language, look, Judge, you got two choices. You can send him up the river to Allenwood Penitentiary for 10 years and really make him a martyr. Or you can let him take this job at this obscure university in Western Canada, and in 2 weeks, the good people of Columbus will forget he was ever there. So the judge thought for about 5 seconds and decided, yeah, that makes sense. So he gave me a suspended sentence, 3 years probation, and so that he wouldn't look too lenient, he also gave me a fine, $1,500, which in 1969 wasn't a huge amount, but it was real money. And so, as it turned out, I did teach summer session at Cornell in the summer of 1969, and then off I went to the University of Saskatchewan. To me, what's important about it is Walt's courage, Walt's incredible academic and political courage in offering me that position before he even knew whether or not I was going to be free to take it. I later learned, many decades later, that Walt actually took a rather dim view of what I had done, because he was thinking primarily in terms of Ohio politics. I wasn't thinking about politics. You don't think about consequences when you're putting yourself on the line like that. You think about moral imperatives. I come out of the Jewish American tradition. The Jewish concept of social justice was always very important in my family. My older brother, who is now 84, retired professor of mathematics at the University of Maryland, was one of the original Cornell Freedom Riders. I don't know how much your generation knows about the Freedom Riders, but they were an incredibly courageous group of young people. There were 437 original Northern Freedom Riders, 5 from Cornell, and my brother was one of them. He was in jail in Jackson, Mississippi, along with 436 other people. And so that tradition of commitment to social justice was very strong in my family, still is. That's what I was thinking about when I did what I did. Walt, of course, coming from Walkerton, Indiana, was not raised in the Jewish tradition. He was raised in the Protestant tradition. And he too had a very powerful sense of social justice. It just manifested itself in different ways. But the fact that even as he disagreed with what I had done, and he didn't even tell me that at the time, I only found that out decades later. The fact that he still offered me that position on the spot. That's who Walt LaFeber was. And here we are, 54 years later. I'm still teaching summer session at Cornell. And the first thing I tell my students every summer is that I come out of the great Cornell tradition of Walter LaFeber. And I have two responsibilities to this new generation of Cornell students. One, of course, is to impart information. But the second, and even more important responsibility, is to pass on to them what I learned from him. Not simply about how to study history, how to research history, how to think about history, but how to base your understanding of the world in which you live upon a thoughtful, balanced, comprehensive understanding of how this country got to be where it is. That's what I took in. That's what I'm giving back. And I will go on doing it as long as I can.
Well, thank you so much. I'm afraid we have to wrap up. I wish we could talk more, but we have another interviewee coming in. But thank you so much. What a lovely story to tell.
Thank you.